Welcome. This is our webinar on security and compliance. Do it right the first time. And it's presented by Venkat Thiruvengadam. He's the CEO of DuploCloud and was an early engineer at Microsoft Azure and the first developer and founding member of Azure's networking team. He wrote significant parts of the Azure compute and network controller stack and saw Azure grow from 100 servers to millions of nodes in just a few years. My name is Tony Barbagallo, marketing lead at DuploCloud and moderator for today's presentation. As we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, type them in and I'll do my best to interject them throughout the talk. We'll also save some time at the end for any additional questions or comments. Now, before I turn the talk over to Venkat, I have just one quick slide on who we are. Excuse me. And as I alluded to during the intro, DuploCloud was founded by the early developers of Microsoft Azure. And it was our vision really to make DevOps and infrastructure as code accessible to everyone, just as the cloud providers have made compute, storage, and networking accessible to everyone. So we have a number of customers, both larger customers as well as startups. You can see some of them listed here: CamiVision, Unifor, Lily.ai, and several others. And with that, let me turn it over to Venkat.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. I'm excited to talk about security and compliance. Like some of the things that actually shows up that comes up in almost all our conversation is like, what's the difference between security and compliance? Like, I think I'm secure, but am I not compliant? Or like, what do I need to do in terms of security? In terms to actually get to compliance. So at the highest level, really speaking, compliance is basically a guideline, and security is the implementation of that guideline. And the guideline can be a lot abstract, but security is actually detailed. Security is about controls, it's about the implementation, and so forth. So for example, a compliance standard could simply say that, okay, make sure that your network infrastructure between production and non-production is segregated and separate. But security is the implementation determines how it is segregated. Like, for example, you can have security groups, based segregation, infrastructure based segregation, and so forth. So, and then that's one part. And the other part is that depending on the compliance standards, some can be more prescriptive, in which they can actually talk about these security controls and tell you exactly what to do, whereas the other ones can be less prescriptive, in which they would just leave it up to you how to do that, but just give you that guidance. Yeah. And over here, I think what is the main similarities? I think the main similarity is that like both of them are meant to manage risk. And you could also say that compliance in some senses is a way of measuring security as well. And one of the key difference is that, like, while security is an ongoing thing that you do every day in terms of like what's happening, like for example, today we have the geopolitical situation. People are bracing for attacks on their cloud infrastructure and finance and banking and whatnot from certain other countries. And we are turning on our firewall security groups and whatnot. Whereas compliance is more like a certification process. People may have gotten certified like 6 months back. It's done typically every year. So if you have just done it 6 months back, there's no action item for you till another 6 months when the auditor comes in. But of course, you have to maintain compliance. And what does maintain compliance mean? Basically making sure that the security controls are in place. And security is constantly evolving, while compliance standards don't evolve as much because they're guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there are like different types of security controls, like starting with, let's say you have network-based security controls. This could be your company network, your home network, your public networks, and the kind of tools that you use to secure them are like your firewall, access control, content filtering software, network intrusion detection, IDS, IPS, like these kind of systems. So that's like network security. Then let's go to the next one.
I was going to ask Venkat. So these network security and like firewalls, the access controls, et cetera. So it sounds like deploying an application in the cloud should be easier than on-prem. So are these controls, whatever they are, the firewalls, IAMs, et cetera, are they already configured when you deploy an application in the cloud?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, cloud, they're not. On the contrary, most of them are like wide open. So what does that mean? So Amazon, Azure, any public cloud, they are a shared security model. While on one hand, it's good that you don't have to worry about physical security of the servers and the physical networks and whatnot, but it is still up to you to go and secure your application, like how your security group should be, how your IAM policy should be, and those kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So next is your devices, sometimes broadly classified as endpoint security as well. So in the devices, you have your, I think my internet is having a bit of, desktop computers, laptops, cell phone, tablets. So this is about antivirus, multi-factor authentication for the devices, device encryption, anti-theft tools, your data leaks prevention softwares, IDP, not IDP, what is it called? Your DLPs, basically, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those are like for devices. Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
Yep. So yeah, on this slide we're talking about sort of the security controls which actually flow into employees and business processes.
Yeah.
And
so these are the ones actually. A lot of times, what happens is that the breaches are actually happened not by third parties or external people, but it is actually done either because a human being has made a mistake by not following the right discipline, or maybe in some cases they are even malicious. So there is a tremendous amount of focus on, and to solve this problem, there is a tremendous amount of focus on business processes. So this includes having people understand and sign to a certain set of security policy that they would adhere to, or for example, having them properly trained, and also keeping them up to date every now and then, and overall like sort of like making sure that the people are doing the right thing. And this is more so in larger companies compared to smaller ones, surely because the surface area is like really that big. So they need to make sure that at that scale, especially with thousands of employees, you need to have the right set of policies so that you could make this happen. Whereas in a smaller company, this is a lot lesser. The processes are much lesser because it's easier to sort of like get a few people in the room and make sure that they're doing the right thing and teach them the right processes and whatnot. So that's the focus on employees, the business processes. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So now coming to the compliance standards, then you could basically bucketize the compliance standard by and large into like three categories. One is your compliance standard based on applicable laws of the land. And these were essentially created so that the compliance standards don't just protect large businesses who can choose to like validate those standards and ask the vendors to follow them, but also can protect people en masse, like the common people. And that's why the governments came up with these standards. And these are by and large about data privacy and protection and whatnot. And the goal is to basically have a standard that applies across the board, and protects common people's information as much as it could protect a business information. So the other one is a more horizontal standard like SOC 2, or there is also ISO, which is adhered by like a lot of organizations, and you don't have to really be in a specific industry. SOC 2 is a very common standard that a lot of people sort of like adhere to. And then there is like industry specific one, which is like the credit card have PCI, the healthcare guys have HIPAA and high trust and so on. So one difference that you would see in industry specific regulations is that almost all industry specific regulations are a lot more prescriptive than your SOC 2 and ISO. What that basically means is that they really get into the detail of how security should be implemented. Whereas SOC 2, in some senses, you could say that it's a little bit more of an abstract standard. In fact, 60% of SOC 2 is, if not more, is more about processes than the actual security controls. But I see more and more the SOC 2 standard also is incorporating more prescriptive controls. And what I see also is that a lot of organization, they use SOC 2 to make sure people's processes are in place, because that's harder for them to go and validate. But when it comes to actual infrastructure security beyond SOC 2, these guys, they will pull in controls from PCI or HIPAA into a separate security questionnaire and pass it on to the vendor and make sure that they adhere to that effectively. So they won't ask them to go get PCI because they may not be handling payment card information, but they still want them to take advantage of all the prescriptive controls which are in PCI. So SOC 2 typically gets added with a security questionnaire. I have not seen almost any enterprise just asking for SOC 2 without a detailed security controls implementation.
So then the bar keeps raising.
Yeah.
We're working with many organizations that are looking at SOC 2 compliance, and yet that may be necessary, but not sufficient for some organizations.
That's right.
And now these compliance standards, right? They don't necessarily guarantee that an application that is provisioned is actually secure, do they?
So, to be honest, it really depends on the standard. Like if somebody tells me that, okay, I'm SOC 2 certified, being a infrastructure security engineer, that probably doesn't mean much to me, right? I would actually want to see what security controls they actually have in place, because I've seen people get SOC 2 certified without really doing much. Whereas on the other hand, if somebody comes and tells me that they are PCI compliant or they are high trust compliant, with a great level of confidence, I would think that they really have a lot of detailed security controls in place. So that really depends on the standard that they are adhering to.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, what are the steps to compliance? I think the first step is to do an assessment of like where you are in terms of what security tools and controls that you have in place. The second high-level step is to study the compliance standard and find out how a certain compliance standard would actually translate to an implementation of your cloud infrastructure. It would be really useful if you could get that mapping, because compliance standards can be very abstract because they are largely written without a particular cloud provider or an infrastructure in mind. So having that table that if you can get, is very useful. And I've seen this table in a lot of companies' websites. Even our own website has a security white paper which has this information. So yeah, so the second step is to find out what needs to be done in order to be compliant, like creating a mapping of controls and implementation, requirements and implementation, and then do a gap assessment between what's there and what's not there, and then try to address them. What I've seen is that in younger companies who generally start without a very compliant mindset, it might be a lot of work to actually go and fix what might have already been done. And it might be far more easier to basically create a compliant infrastructure and drop the cloud the application into that and get compliant and then go from there. So it really depends. Whereas in a much larger organization, most likely they must have gone through their regular infosec processes and whatnot, and might be in a better situation. But that's really the kind of high level steps to compliance.
And it seems like this slide alone has spawned a whole industry of new software solution vendors. Right. Recently, we've been working with some companies, Vanta and Drata and Align, that have tried to, that have actually put a software solution around this to somewhat automate this process as well.
They're great, right? So because they do two things. One is that they automatically give you a mapping of how it needs to be done, let's say in a particular cloud provider. And on top of that, they can actually connect to your cloud provider and then do a gap assessment and tell you where you are, for example, right? Again, it depends on what compliance standard that you're following. If you're SOC 2 and all, they do a much better job. Obviously, if it is PCI, the gaps may be far too much. But so the good thing that they do is that they give you the mapping and they give you an assessment. But what they don't do is that they actually don't do any mitigation, or they actually don't do any implementation of those missing controls, so to speak. So that's still left up to you. And there's a whole different DevOps, SecOps industry, which actually helps you go and do that. So there is an audit management industry which tells you how things should be and where you stand. And then there is the DevSecOps industry, which basically helps you get there, right? So, or it's better if you start from the scratch doing those things.
Interesting. Well, then that is actually a great lead into this next slide.
Yeah. So what do? We belong to the latter industry, basically. So we are a DevSecOps as a service platform. The technology underneath it, so if you were to basically say what is the number one problem with DevSecOps, the number one problem with DevSecOps is that you don't find people. Why? Because you are really looking for somebody who A, is an operations person, so he can handle infrastructure. B, is an InfoSec person who understands compliance control. And C, he's a programmer, so that they can write automation code to do this right? So these are three different skill sets that historically has never been together in a single person in the industry. So that's why they're like really, really hard to find. So what we do is that we sort of like take these three things and merge them into a single automation platform, which basically helps you deploy not only compliant and secure infrastructure, but also takes care of all your automation needs, all the way from provisioning of services, application, logging, monitoring, CI/CD, and whatnot. And of course, behind the bottom line and the core value is that if you use this tool to deploy your application, you would be fully secure and compliant.
Oh, that's great. So I think we'll go on to the next slide, but we really get into a little bit more kind of detail on. I used in here, Venkat, PCI as an example, mainly because of the discussion we just had, which where we talked about SOC 2 being somewhat fluid and more abstract in nature. So maybe you could just touch on some of these controls, and I think we show them a little bit more detail in the following slides as well.
Right. So let's go through some of this stuff, right, as a practical example. So on the left hand side, the first column, what you're seeing is that this is how the control is described in the PCI standard. So what does it say? It says requirements for a firewall for each internet connection and between any demilitarized zone and the internal network zone. So if you see this, they have used a language which is really very common and cloud agnostic. Right. Well, the advantage of this is that you kind of understand their intent, what they are trying to get to, but you don't really know how this needs to be done in a particular cloud provider, because it's not. That's where I think your skill set as a DevSecOps engineer comes in. So as an example, effectively, let's say if you're operating in Amazon, I think the way I would do it is that you can actually have different VPCs, definitely, like let's say for prod and non-prod. Then you have different subnets. One is public facing, one is private facing. So your public facing is your sort of a DMZ with which is exposed to the public internet, and maybe you just put some external load balancers over there. Whereas on a private network, you basically implement all the virtual machines and the databases and whatnot. And then on top of that, in addition to separating subnets, you actually place security groups in place in order to achieve what you needed to do. So that's an example of how you can take a high level requirement and then getting into the granularities. Now, this is still tremendous amount of granularity that I talked about, and you need to know a lot of things how to do it. But if you use, let's say, softwares, right, like for example, DuploCloud, there are a lot of these lower level abstraction. Okay, what is a VPC? Do I need to create a VPC or security group or an IAM role, instance profile? Those things are sort of like taken care for you. So Duplo Readymade gives you a certain isolation construct, for example. So there's a construct of infrastructure, which is essentially your network-based isolation. So each infrastructure is a VPC. And it's also, let's say if you're using Kubernetes, it's a Kubernetes cluster. So two infrastructures would be separated by network completely and also separated by Kubernetes cluster or ECS cluster and so on. So that's, for example, the infrastructure. That's one construct it gives you. The second construct Duplo gives you is that you can create what is known as a tenant or a project under an infrastructure. And tenant would be your dev tenant, stage tenant, prod tenant. So what was the infrastructure? Infrastructure was production, non-production. And under an infrastructure, you have a tenant. Like in non-production, you can have dev, stage, QA, whereas under production, you can basically maybe have pre-prod and prod and so forth. So these constructs really hide very low-level details. And then at a high level, you can say, I'm going to go and work in this particular project, launch VMs, and the software automatically takes care of a lot of the low-level details.
And that's all basically set up within this UI.
Yeah.
Now we do have a video product demo on our website. I did not want to include it here since it would be a little bit redundant, and people can just go there and take a look at it if they're interested. But I think this is very helpful in being able to go through the various facets of really what a DevOps engineer would have to create in each of these to meet each of these requirements.
Right.
Okay. And then this was the second one from that list previously.
Yeah. So I think what you do is that once I sort of like touched upon that 70% of the security controls and also the compliance guideline actually have to be done at provisioning time. This actually is a very common misconception that people think that I can do what I need to, whatever I want in provisioning, and then it's easy to go and fix it after the fact by throwing in some tools. That's actually not the case. Only 30% of the controls come in post-provisioning, which are, you could also call them monitoring controls, for example. So this is where your OSSEC, WASU, AWS Inspector, intrusion detection, CIS benchmarks, vulnerability scanning, raising an alarm, monitoring a metric, figuring out from logs what's wrong and what not. Those things are like sort of taken care for you. So that's what we also do. So we have two very distinct pieces of our software. Our core software does all the provisioning and everything. That's where the focus is. And then we integrate with a lot of third-party tools so that we can trigger them to do an assessment and show you on a real-time basis in a single pane of glass how things look compared to provisioning versus where the end state is.
So you're saying then typically I might deploy an application, run these tools, and these tools, for instance, and not using DuploCloud, these tools might say that there's a number of security issues with the deployed application. Now, do I have to go back and essentially re-provision my application?
No, I mean, if you don't use DuploCloud, a software like DuploCloud, or if you did not have this mindset from the get-go, that's what will happen. Right, and there'll be a lot of rework. But if you're using, like, let's say our software, we do it at the get-go. The general idea is when you bring these tools, they're purely giving you validation that there aren't any alerts.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think these are all the various different controls that we talked about: cloud fire integrity monitoring, CloudTrail, integrating with your WAF and whatnot. So these are like the various different stages of our implementation, and there is a detailed security white paper which talks about how this is implemented from provisioning to post-provisioning.
Great.
Yeah, this is a case study, and I think, Tony, you want to talk about this case study with Cami?
Yeah, so Cami Vision has been a customer of ours for a while, and they were really looking to build a new solution for the SMB market. They their initial application, while it was working fine, they really felt like in order to attack the SMB market, they needed to adopt microservices and containers and really get a much stronger security posture around NIST and PCI. So again, really some great benefits using DuploCloud. They launched their product about 6 months ahead of their original schedule, with our help with the software platform and our support assistants, and they were able to very quickly pass these compliance requirements. And now, and I think it was what's another aspect of security with cloud-based applications is it is an ongoing effort. Compliance standards change, security controls can be changed or modified going forward, and for them it's been very easy to adapt to these ongoing compliance and security changes. With the proper software platform, it's actually, if you will, monitoring for drift. So that's something else that the DuploCloud platform does, and make sure that any changes get addressed and remediated.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so finally,
and if you want, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so finally, what's the summary, right? Like I said, compliance is a guideline, security is the implementation, right? So that's how I think you would go about it. Compliance is a validation by a third party based on a particular standard in a particular industry or a land or a country or a state, whereas security is actually the implementation of various tools and processes. Compliance should be compliance typically happens like once a year. Security is an ongoing thing. Take an overarching approach to security and compliance, understand the risks of your organization, know your legal and regulatory obligations. And in general, compliance standards can be abstract. So really try to understand the security controls. And I would always do more than less to meet a particular compliance standard, if it happens to be very abstract.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I interjected much of the questions that came in throughout the talk, and I haven't seen any additional ones. So with that, we'll end our talk. Thank you again, Venkat, and thank you all for listening, and hope to see you again and speak to you again in the near future.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.